Okay, so let's get started with the sovereign debt panel, and we're going to be beginning with, no, I haven't forgotten, um, with Anna Gelpern talking about between contract and statute in sovereign debt. Is that still the title?
Well, there's one change and it's significant, and
Okay.
that'll begin. Thank you very much, Kevin and Benedict, and everyone here for including me. I've learned a lot already, and what I want to focus on, I thought I was going to talk about the space between contract reform and statutory reform in sovereign debt, which is a field that is very self-conscious about innovating and does it sort of very with much publicity and furor every couple of years. And in particular, I was going to talk about the UNCTAD principles for responsible sovereign lending and borrowing, which in fact seek to occupy this space between contract and statute and sovereign debt. But then as I started rethinking this and rethinking the background paper that's posted on the conference website, I thought, well, actually, I don't want to talk about that at all. And in fact, I'm completely unconvinced about the existence and value of the space between contract and statute. And so it's called Beyond Contract and Statute. So there we have it. So the UNCTAD project is one of a number of self-conscious innovation projects in the sovereign debt space. And it is customary to paint innovation in this space as a contest between statutory bankruptcy and private ordering in the form of contract change, with codes of conduct occupying kind of the middle space and being a compromise between the two. And each form has its partisans. I mean, roughly, the statutory bankruptcies for the lefties and contract reform is for the righties, and then they kind of meet somewhere in between. Bankruptcy has been, losing for decades or centuries, depending on how you count. And the reasons given for that are that it's all about, the difficulty of giving up sovereignty, market opposition, North versus South, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what I suggest in this very early stage project is that things are a lot more complicated and fluid, with a lot of actors competing with a very wide range of motives, making, shifting alliances. And in fact, this is more of an agenda-setting project, it turns out, rather than kind of a backward-looking project. The message, I think, is that to figure out whether any particular innovation in sovereign debt is pro-development at any given time, we need much thicker institutional study, looking at the actors, their motives, their alliances, and whether the reform they're pushing, the innovation they're pushing, is really innovation, or whether it's innovation that, in fact, is trying to preempt real reform. So the practical takeaway, I think, is we have to be skeptical, and we have to sort of do more thick institutional study. So I'll spend the first minute or two on what I think are the big problems in the sovereign debt space that motivate reform initiatives and innovation. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about who the innovators and the players are in this space, examine some of the main competing forms of innovation, and then we'll close with some thoughts on kind of research going forward on how to evaluate innovation. What is this sovereign debt space, and why does it need reform and innovation? It is, in fact, a very peculiar space, legally, economically, and politically. So the legal construct is kind of bizarre. On the one hand, this debt is by and large unenforceable because of sovereign immunity and asset immunity in particular. On the other hand, because there is no bankruptcy regime in this space, this debt is non-dischargeable, so it's forever. So on the one hand, creditors can't really enforce it. On the other hand, debtors can never really get rid of it. So there's this kind of perpetual sort of Tom and Jerry race around the world, and we can talk about examples in our free time. The other distinguishing feature of this space is that it's unbelievably fragmented. Now, I don't think that's unique to sovereign debt. I think that that's something that you see in a lot of places in international law and institutions. But the one kind of picture slide I have really shows just how unbelievably steroidally fragmented this space is and how, therefore, difficult it is to govern. Now, in terms of economic concerns with sovereign debt, there's the usual time inconsistency of politicians and the intergenerational kind of transfer concerns with debt, right? So, debt is borrowed by the government today, may be repaid by the next government or even by the next generation of taxpayers. The incentives to overborrow that come from having unenforceable debt and debt with no enforceable priority structure in particular. And then ex post, there's the well-known debt overhang problem, the fact that countries end up with too much debt, which then deters investment and stunts growth. The political problems that give rise to demand for innovation are actually embodied in some would-be legal doctrines. So one goes to the legitimacy of the original borrowing, right? So unlike the debt overhang concern, this is not about efficiency and it's not about too much debt, but rather it's about debt that was borrowed not in the interest of the people. It was borrowed by perhaps corrupt leaders for corrupt oppressive purposes. And therefore, even if it is not too much, even if it is just $1, it should not be enforced. There's a distinct concern which is prominent in the Jubilee debt relief campaigns, and that is more closely related to the debt overhang problem, but it's a political argument. It's an argument that a country that has too much debt lacks policy autonomy. So there are some wonderful quotes from Pope John Paul II, that are all about how too much debt is a form of slavery. Right. And the last big political concern that again motivates innovation in this space or demand for innovation in this space is that even though debt restructuring tends to be fairly predictable and routinized, it is not intelligible to the public, and partly because it's so fragmented, accountability is very difficult. So this is just really mostly for the just ridiculous caricature that sovereign debt restructuring is today, right? So you have debtor states on the bottom, you have restructuring institutions in the middle, so bonds are restructured in one place, government-to-government debt in another, debt to banks yet in another. The IMF is the only formal institution in the middle line for a restructuring institution. It sets the financial envelope for the resources available to the country, and then the top line is the various creditors in multilateral institutions, states, and private creditors that restructure their debts in the various institutions in the middle row, and there is no centralized place to ensure that everyone is treated equitably, that all debt is restructured, that the government receives comprehensive relief and a fresh start. And again, all of these have very problematic and limited kind of paths to accountability. Now, who are the innovators in this space who are trying to solve some of these problems? International multilateral organizations, and UNCTAD I already mentioned is one of them. Certainly UNDESA, another UN agency, is another. The International Monetary Fund briefly was at the forefront of this, of innovation with its proposal for the sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. Development banks are doing more kind of incremental work in heavily indebted poor countries and multilateral debt relief initiatives. National governments and national institutions are also pushing their own innovation agendas. Norway in particular has both been forgiving its own debt in interesting ways and then funding a lot of projects, including the UNCTAD project I mentioned. France, in its capacity as Paris Club Secretariat, looks out for government-to-government debt restructuring and tries to innovate in that space, or preempt innovation for that matter. Large emerging market governments have their own agendas. National courts increasingly are making a lot of law in this space and pushing innovation directly, indirectly. I didn't mention multilateral tribunals, actually. The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, of all things, got involved recently when an Argentine military ship got seized. So a lot of innovation in a lot of places. The G groupings, of course, are where a lot of the policy is coordinated. Civil society groups are, pushing their own agendas, and then you have market actors, bank groups, bondholder groups, as well as individual creditors that are pushing for reform, and each of them, I think, incredibly claim to be innovating here. What form does innovation take? Treaty is kind of the mother of them all, so the holy grail is a treaty-based sovereign bankruptcy regime, which seems to be politically out of reach. We have had several waves of really radical contract reform, which has been portrayed as a private ordering coup, but was very much directed by governments. There's an attempt to elaborate customary law in this space, particularly the doctrine of odious debt, and this goes to the legitimacy of borrowing. Institutional innovation in terms of both dispute resolution and audit institutions, as well as restructuring. And then this middle space, the soft law space of codes of conduct, right, including the UNCTAD principles, which purport to govern both, or seek to govern, aspire to govern both lender and borrower behavior in the sovereign debt space. Now that I've described it, this is really my penultimate slide, and this is really what the project is about. Halfway through thinking about what innovation looks like in this area, I realized that some of this innovation is in fact anti-innovation, right? Some of this innovation has as its express purpose the preemption of more radical reform. Okay? So, for example, contract reform and some of the codes of conduct were very explicitly, very openly, very self-consciously put forward in order to defeat bankruptcy initiatives. Okay? Similarly, deep debt relief, both bilateral and multilateral, was in part made easier and happened sooner because of the concerns about the rise of the odious debt doctrine and the possibility that more radical reform might gain momentum. There's also competition to innovate to control reform, right? So codes of conduct are an interesting form here because some groups use them to preempt bankruptcy as kind of a private ordering occupying the space. Others use them as a step towards bankruptcy. So it's very hard to tell from the form of innovation what the actual goal is and what the result might be. Sometimes statute is progressive, but not always. Sometimes contract is kind of the product of a market cabal, and sometimes it is not. Sometimes, same thing with codes of conduct. They can take you either way. There is a very vigorous competition among institutions, even among UN agencies, among multilaterals, certainly among governments and civil society organizations for constituents, for resources, for credit, for ideas, right? So a lot of the innovation is driven by kind of near-term institutional goals. How are you going to get funding? Are you going to be in charge of, are you going to get, so the IMF SDRM project was kind of a great way for the IMF to take center stage. Now, It's not to say that the whole project was cynical, but there were certainly institutional goals as well. And there were some strategic and tactical alliances that made this innovation go as far as it did, even though very few people think that it had any chance of coming to fruition. So last question is, now that we have this competition, how should we think about this? Is this the 1,000 flowers blooming, and in the end, this is good for development? Is this kind of a much more, disconcerting realist story? And how should we assess if, our goal here is to figure out what innovation in sovereign debt management is good for development? How do we evaluate this? And really, so far, my only takeaway is that you really cannot evaluate it by just looking at the form of the innovation. This is a very sort of pedestrian conclusion. But rather, you have to look at the shifting constituencies for any particular reform, the shifting alliances, the particular channels of accountability behind any given initiative at any given time. And I think we really have to rethink our attachment to the form of innovation, namely, contract or statute, because it's not clear to me that form necessarily gets you development effectiveness. So that's that. How do I, let's see. Here. I'm trying to make it go black. Oh, there.
So our next presentation will be Matthias Goldmann, who is going to be speaking also about sovereign debt, and in this case, sovereign debt and fiscal policy innovation. So,
can we speak?
Oh, you have this.
Sorry, I have to set up my. Sorry for that.
So just discuss it.
Just no, I don't. Just leave it. Thanks. Okay, here we are. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. Thank you to the organizers of this conference. I'll talk to a topic that is a little bit different. I talk to what happens before we get to the point that Anna was talking about. Before we get to a sovereign debt crisis, there needs to be a number of decisions regarding fiscal policy. And I would like to talk about fiscal sovereign debt and fiscal policy innovation. So I've got a number of theses which I would like to explain here, or three theses to be precise. The first thesis is that good fiscal policy is characterized by what I call public reasoning. Behind public reasoning, there's a certain political theory. I'm going to explain that in a second. The second thesis is that problems of the past in fiscal policy have to do with a lack of public reasoning in fiscal policy making. And my final thesis is that innovations in fiscal policy making, as we have experienced them over the last few decades, in particular in a developmental context, should promote public reasoning. So that is a measure to assess them. And I think it's not only a normative measure, but it's also a descriptive concept, because many of these innovations correspond to an idea of public reasoning. So this is my outline. After the introduction, which I come to conclude here, I will now say a few words on the concept of public reasoning before I go to the third point, which is about fiscal policy innovation that might promote public reasoning. So my second part will be the concept of public reasoning as a guideline for fiscal policy innovation. And here I'm going to harass you with a little bit of legal theory, or political theory rather. I'm doing so in a very stylized fashion, so please, any legal theory LLMs, don't tell my former teachers what I'm doing here. Just very broadly, in political theory, I would say that we can distinguish two broad approaches to the idea of democracy. The one approach is what some call consequentialism. It focuses on outputs, and it's a school of thought that takes its origin broadly with Marx, Smith, Bentham, the whole utilitarian school, and including John Stuart Mill. And the other school that is kind of opposed to this strand of theory is deontology. It focuses on inputs. It tries to create ideal institutions. And that is a school that has been prominently advanced by thinkers like Kant, Rawls, and Habermas, the latter two theories being probably among the most popular ones our days. So that is a very stylized fashion of distinguishing theories. Now each of these approaches has its problems, its set of problems. What are the problems of a consequentialist approach? So consequentialism says that it's important to achieve good end results. And that, of course, raises the question how to define outcomes, how to define good results, and how to achieve distributed justice. You need to have an idea of distribution in order to assess whether a result is good or not. And again, another problem of consequentialist theories is that it might end up in a situation where the ends might justify any means, even the most repulsive ones, because they have aggregate benefits to it. Of course, the ontological strand of theory also goes with a whole bunch of problems. One problem is that there is a lot of idealizations in these ideal institutional settings, which the theories by Kant and Rawls and Habermas imply. For example, there are assumptions about principal-agent relationships which are supposed to run very smoothly, whereas in reality we know they don't. And what is, that is kind of related to that, what is if institutions don't work as intended? What if they don't achieve the outcomes we expect from them? Outcomes being, everybody having a nice life, and the life they imagine, the life they vote the parties for in order to implement the policies they think they're good. What if it doesn't work? What if there's a slack in the political system? And then again, a huge problem is how to achieve global justice in a deontological approach. Deontological approaches always are based on just institutions, but we have very few institutions on the global level that are of an ideal or that correspond to the ideal requirements set out in these theories. For example, deliberative, representative institutions. The UN Global General Assembly is no such institution. So both strands of theory have their problems. Now here is maybe the solution. That is Amartya Sen, as you know, a person who needs no further introduction. And his topic is, or his theory has been set out in 2009 in a comprehensive book that is based on work which he has been done over a whole set of years. And this is, what is the idea of justice? The idea of justice is at its basis, it's an output-oriented approach to democracy, but it includes a lot of elements from input-oriented theories, because Amartya Sen has learned a lot from John Rawls and worked together with him very, very closely. So his measure for outcomes is called capabilities. I guess many of you will be familiar with that concept. Capabilities is something like rights, but it's more than just negative freedoms. It includes the freedom to actually pursue one's goals and the freedom of effective choice. So it means that it is having a capability is having a right in a much more practical and real sense, not just a theoretical sense, not just a negative sense, like the state shouldn't interfere into your activities, but the state should actually give you the possibility to pursue your own goals. So this is his basic concept of, let's say, happiness. So how to define capabilities. And that is where the idea of public reasoning comes in. Public reasoning is originally called public reason. That is a Kantian notion. Kant uses it a lot, and Rawls and Habermas built on that as well, and so does Amartya Sen. At the bottom of the line, public reasoning means nothing else but deliberative reasoning, justifying your decisions in a way that is acceptable to everybody and that is not just based on idiosyncratic reasons. So, and that means the central idea is that decisions should be impartial. They shouldn't only serve your individual interests, and that is the case if they are, according to Amartya Sen, are based on information from all affected people. So that is what he calls open impartiality as opposed to closed impartiality, what we have in the nation state. The results should be reasoned, so you need to give reasons and justify your decisions, and you should check your decisions against or for self-interest. That is kind of the idea that Adam Smith has called the impartial spectator. And of course, you need to have institutional setups to do so. So that is the idea of public reasoning, and he says that by defining capabilities in such an open way, you will end up at a very at a concept of happiness, so to say, that is open to a pluralistic society. So how to ensure capabilities? once you have defined them, you need to ensure that they're actually implemented. Well, the same answer is public reasoning. Also, in the implementation of your policies, you need to follow the idea of public reasoning, which means of deliberative discourse, so to say, and use as much information as possible you can get from everywhere, and use reasoning in reassessing your decisions or changing your policies, and you should try to be impartial. Now, democracy has an intrinsic relation with public reasoning, and that is why his theory is actually a theory of democracy, because it fosters public reasoning in many ways. It creates accountability, and that motivates decision makers to actually, for example, seek the information they need, or argue, or give reasons. It fosters transparency, which helps to discover problems. It necessitates free speech, which also serves the same purpose, and it is open to value pluralism. So it's a theory that might meet the requirement of impartiality. So much for the theory of democracy. The example which Amartya Sen has referred to numerous times is that of famines in rural India, which disappeared with the beginning of democracy, because all of a sudden all the necessary information was there at the time it needed to be to prevent a famine. That has been the subject of a huge debate, which I don't want to go into. What I want to do now is to come back to fiscal policy and show you how I think that public reasoning relates to it. Now, here is my thesis 2 and 3. I would like to show in the following that some problems that we've had in the past have to do with the lack of public reasoning, and that innovations in fiscal policy making should promote public reasoning. Again, this is normative and descriptive. So I come back to my outline, and here is now number 3, fiscal policy innovation, promoting public reasoning, question mark. I will discuss 3 issues here. The first issue is procedural changes, fiscal transparency. Now, there have been serious transparency problems in the past in fiscal policy. Some of them are well known. For example, the state bankruptcies in the developing world that we've experienced since the 1970s, to some extent were due to the fact that it was a highly intransparent organization of the debt. States very often didn't really have an appropriate overview on the loans they had, on their maturities, on the interest rates, and so on. And the first step in an insolvency proceeding, or in those reschedulings that at the time were mostly organized by the Paris and London clubs, was to take stock of that debt. Something which, of course, should, in an ideal world, have happened before. Another example of a lack of transparency relates to secret budgets. For example, in some states, the military budget is not in the general overall budget. Now, a very unfortunate recent case is Egypt, where the military council has again received very, very large, far-reaching powers to define its own budget. Now, what are the solutions that are proposed to fix this transparency problem? There's an international policy which is being organized by the IMF. That's the IMF Fiscal Transparency Program. And they have developed a code and a manual on fiscal transparency, and they try to define some principles. And those principles are 4, namely, first, clarity of roles and responsibilities. So everybody should know what he has to do at which time, and that includes a clear assignment of responsibilities even in difficult cases. For example, public-private partnerships. That is a major issue. If you organize a public-private partnership, all of a sudden nobody might feel responsible anymore. The second principle is open budget processes. You should set up a timetable and formulate explicit fiscal policy objectives, just in order to foster some debate, and also some monitoring and reporting practices are required to that end. The third principle is that all this information should be publicly available. So that is, again, something that matches very well with the idea of public reasoning. And the fourth reason is assurances of integrity need to be put in place. For example, ethical standards, external audits, and so on. Something that I would say helps policymakers to be impartial. So if we really check those 4 principles, or try to abstract from them, what one could say is that these principles try to promote public reasoning in policymaking. And a lot of that has been implemented already. Some countries have adopted fiscal responsibility laws. mostly emerging economies, in fact, like Brazil, India, Mexico, Chile, Nigeria. They've set up commissions, for example, in Nigeria, we've got fiscal responsibility commissions which conduct periodic studies, and we've got debt management offices which conduct the audits and which have a fair margin of independence in order to ensure their impartiality. And of course, everything they produce is being published. So a lot of transparency has has been achieved in that respect, and so I think both the problem and the solution can be explained by reference to the concept of public reasoning. Another example would be medium-term financial frameworks. Some countries have been hesitant to adopt them because it means quite a huge commitment. For example, in Brazil, that was the part which they deleted from their fiscal responsibility law. But in other countries, there are, for example, 3 years or 5 years frameworks, and of course that also fosters public reasoning because you have a goal, and you need to discuss which goal, in terms of budget deficit, for example, you want to achieve, and you need to discuss whether you achieve it or not. And another example for increasing transparency, although that only relates indirectly, is fostering the role of the legislature. So in many countries there has been a great move towards the legislature, giving the legislator more power. For example, in Chile, an interesting feat is that the president has the power to suggest the budget, but the president may not suggest something that has effects beyond his term. Otherwise, he needs a larger majority in parliament. So I'll come to the next point in the interest of time and talk a little bit about substantive rules on borrowing, because there's also much that I think could be described as public reasoning. Now, why do we need rules on borrowing? I think the rationale for rules is quite clear. Otherwise, there might be politicians which take self-interested decisions and follow a short time horizon and disrespect requirements of intergenerational justice. So interests of people that are not really represented with a voice of their own. So again, in order to bring all these voices and all this information in and to take all the partial self-interested decisions out, it's good to have rules that foster public reasoning. And there's a whole bunch of rules. The most famous model of rulemaking is, or of fiscal policy making, is the so-called golden rule, which says that you should not borrow more than you invest. But that again goes with a whole bunch of problems because simply the question is, what is an investment and what is a productive investment? And we've seen many difficulties with these rules. Some of these rules are very rigid, they're overly rigid. So that is a kind of rule which I would say is not very conducive to public reasoning. Better examples for rules are numerical debt ceilings or deficit ceilings. There's different models. And again, we've got inflexible models like very strict rules which are referenced to, for example, GDP, like your debt shouldn't exceed 40% of your GDP. That's a rule adopted by Mercosur, and the Andean community sets it at 50%. The European Union sets it at 60%. Sometimes I'm not so sure whether we can really separate developing and developed states in the sovereign debt context, but that's another debate. And apart from these inflexible rules, which I think are not very conducive to public reasoning because they force a decision at a point where it might be inappropriate, there's more flexible rules, and that is something which I find very interesting from a public reasoning perspective. For example, rules that are tagged to your economic development, like you can borrow in bad times, and you should save money in good times. That's the model that the EU has proposed. Another interesting model is that of India. India has a non-binding aggregate ceiling, and that ceiling is being reviewed every 5 years, and it's amended. And so it's a rule that prevents that you actually break it and thereby cause a shock, but it's a rule that creates a discussion about how much debt you can actually achieve. I'll skip the third point on crisis resolution. That was, I would like to expand a little bit on the concept of ownership here and rather come to my conclusion. And my conclusion would be that I hope I could show you a little bit that public reasoning is a meaningful concept, although it might be very controversial, and I don't want to say that this is the only idea of democracy that one should buy, but it's an interesting idea that relates democracy to financial issues, and therefore it could guide our thinking about fiscal policy. So public reasoning stands for a move from substance to deliberation. Instead of trying to really regulate outcomes, we should rather think about processes, about argumentative processes. And again, and that brings me back to Anna's presentation, the UNCTAD principles for promoting responsible sovereign lending and borrowing are an excellent example in that respect, because they contain very few substantive and many procedural and tentative and flexible rules, and I think that is the future for fiscal policy making. Thank you very much. Sorry for overtime. Sorry. Thank you.
Do you need to come here? And finally, we've got Katharina Pistor speaking about the innovation that wasn't. So, Katharina.
Thank you very much, Kevin and Benedict and the other organizers for having me here. I'll try to be as coherent as possible, but I just got back from Hong Kong last night and my body keeps telling me that it's actually 3:50 a.m. rather than p.m. and my brain is trying to send different signals. Let's see who succeeds in the end. So I just want to mention the subtitle to my paper, because that's important for the argument. It's Sovereign Debt Contracts and the Structure of Global Finance, and I want to emphasize structure of global finance. I don't really know that much about sovereign debt. Everything I know from Anna and her co-author Mito Gulati, and they participated with me in a project that was trying to rethink the relationship between law and finance across different financial markets. And I just want to say a few words about that new framework that we have been developing, because I think it explains the punchline that I have here. And the punchline is that the same identical contractual provisions or other legal or contractual innovations mean very different things in different types of context. And I want to say a little bit more about context, namely that this context can actually be understood and you can make predictions about where the meaning might be different, because the context I'm talking about is sort of a highly hierarchically structured financial systems, whether domestically or globally. So what we've developed here is now the legal theory of finance, and just to push a little bit of an advertisement, it's just coming out in the Journal of Comparative Economics, and the online version is already out, so if you have an interest in that, you're free to look at that. It is based on two premises in economic theory that were forgotten for many, many years, but have come back with ferocity in the context of the global financial crisis, namely the issue of fundamental uncertainty, a la Frank Knight and Maynard Keynes, and the issue of liquidity volatility in financial markets, something that Hyman Minsky has been talking a lot about. So we're starting with these two premises. I'm happy to say more about them in the Q&A if you like. And then we add to that actually financial markets are legally constructed. Every IOU is essentially a contract, and what has happened over the last 30 years or so as we moved from relational finance or entity finance into global financial systems, we've tried to create contracts that are ever more legally binding, both in the private sphere but also in the sovereign debt sphere. So we write all kinds of covenants in order to shift the risk or the cost of dealing with future uncertainty to the other party. The problem is, of course, that you can't purge uncertainty from the system. If uncertainty is fundamental, then it will haunt us at some point. And this then sort of gives us what we call the law of finance paradox, and that has basically three elements. The first being that you need law and legal constructs to build large-scale financial systems, including sovereign debt markets. However, if you enforce all contracts as written ex ante, irrespective of changes that might have happened in the meantime, you will blow up the financial system, not and precisely if everybody plays by the rules. So a typical response to that is to suspend the full force of the law, but that doesn't happen equally throughout the system, but highly selectively. Law tends to be more elastic at the apex or the core of the system and more rigidly enforced on its periphery. So this periphery and also this hierarchical structure with core and periphery is quite fundamental in thinking about what we do in the context of fundamental uncertainty, and I want to suggest that this is also quite fundamental in thinking about what contractual innovation or other legal innovation actually does in different parts of the financial system. So let me just maybe say a few words how this plays itself out in the real world. About 2 years ago, I was in Madrid at a conference that dealt with the beginning Euro crisis. And the then Minister of Finance from Spain was present and suggested that he was completely puzzled by financial markets because they were having actually tantrums about a debt instrument that had been very well known. Sovereign debt is one of the oldest, simplest debt instruments, not some financial innovation notwithstanding, and all of a sudden they were throwing tantrums about Spanish debt in 2010. It was unlike CDOs and CDSs and other financial instruments where all of a sudden people argued we don't know what it is or who holds it or what it really means and how it could be enforced, etc. These were straightforward sovereign debt problems, sovereign debt contracts. What I want to suggest here is that what happened to Spain was not that these instruments were not understood or that they all of a sudden had provisions that had not been in there before, which was not true for Spain to begin with, but that in the context of the European crisis, the major question that came up was who actually will stand in for the debt of all the countries in the Eurozone and who will be the last man standing. So is Spain at the core or at the periphery? Will we trying to enforce the debt as written, and if so, can Spain stand up for its own debt, or will anybody else step in? And I think this sort of exposes the structure of the Eurozone, of course, which had been designed with provisions that suggested you could deal with problems of financial governance by ex-ante rules in the Maastricht Treaty, just basically having debt ceilings and all the rest of it, but did not account for the possibility of fundamental uncertainty. Fundamental uncertainty, of course, having played itself out in the context of the global financial crisis, when all of a sudden many countries had to step in and socialize private debt in order to save their financial system from collapse. And once then these governments had stepped in, the question had to come up, sort of who can they pay? Can they pay? And is the amount of fiscal resources they expended on the financial sector, on socializing the private debt, is that sustainable given the growth rates of these countries? Now, as you've seen over the last couple of years, we get a very clear sense in the Euro context, of course, who's at the core and who's on the periphery of the system. Cyprus is clearly on the periphery. Greece was sort of hovering between core and periphery, and I think in 2010 it was a little bit closer to the core than it became at the end of 2012. Spain, I would say, is still very much at the core. So what determines where you are in this hierarchically structured system? Well, to some extent you can try to manipulate it, but not only. It is very much a relational setup. It depends on both sides, and I think the key issue in the Euro crisis in particular, but you can see this in other contexts as well, is what is the probability that the core will blow up if you won't be rescued, right? So the more important an entity, a state or a bank is for the core, the more likely it is that it will be rescued and that law will be suspended to rescue this particular entity, and that is by definition means that it's closer to the core. If you're more on the periphery, we'll simply enforce these contracts. So this is a little bit of a background to the question, what actually are financial innovations and how are financial innovations used and what is the meaning of different new contractual provisions in the context of financial systems. And I think I want to make the broader claim that you can think about financial innovation in many more cases than the one thing that I want to pull out, which is Anna's and Mito's famous investigation of collective action clauses all over the world. So if you haven't read their older work or you're not familiar yet with the more recent paper that they're also publishing in the Journal of Comparative Economics in May, take a look at that paper. What they've basically been trying to do is sort of trace the logic of collective action clauses. Why is it that they're being adopted in the first place? Why is it, and this is even more puzzling, why is it that 10 years after they have first been adopted in the New York governed contracts in England, they were much more common. But why is it that after they finally become more common for emerging market debt, but also we now have data that actually they don't make much of a difference, right? They don't actually affect the price for debt that is being issued. There's no differential between those issued with or without CACs. And why is it that if you then have sovereign debt crisis, even with contracts where you have CACs, they don't really play a role in the way it's being resolved? After all this sort of ambiguity, what they really do, the Euro member states embrace CACs as the solution to their sovereign debt crisis, right? So what does all this mean? And what I want to suggest is what it means really is that it's a signaling device to suggest to the market that we're jointly in this in this crisis. So if we're still together, so we all do the same thing. We all now adopt CACs into our contracts, but knowing full well and also signaling to some extent this is not the same as full mutualization of debt, right? So we signal to the world that we're together, but every player in the game knows exactly who might be ever invoking CACs because they will really default and who might not, right? So CACs won't, at least for the moment, affect the price of German debt for sure, and nobody will have qualms about that, but it might affect the debt of other countries. So it's a signaling device that is, if you have to, I think, project it against the deeper structures of the global financial system and its hierarchical structure to know what it can possibly mean. And as Anna and Mito suggest in their analysis of the collective action clauses in history, they have different meanings in different contexts, and the point that I would like to make here is that the structure of the financial system is quite fundamental in understanding why this might be the case. Let me maybe make two further short comments on the meaning of innovation, because Anna brought this up as well, and I think it's an important point. So I say in my paper at some point, I treat CACs as an innovation, although they weren't really new. English law had long known CACs, so they've been around for a while, but their transposition into many other contracts of emerging market debt, including those that were issued under the law of New York State, I treat as an innovation. But innovation, of course, doesn't mean anything good. Innovation just means it's different from what it was before. So I don't want to associate with innovation with progressiveness, and therefore wouldn't use necessarily the term anti-innovation, but we can discuss that. It's just a change. But I also want to distinguish innovation from invention, and Paget and Powell make that, I think, quite important distinction. Innovation is marginal change, so you tweak a little bit at the margin, and that's sort of, if it's sort of sufficiently new, we can call it innovation. A real invention would be a shift in the way we treat sovereign debt, and could also be then maybe a shift in how we might allocate the cost of dealing with uncertainty in the global financial system. And I think that actually would require something like a bankruptcy regime. So whatever purchasing power we might get out of the question whether it's statutory or contractual, how we govern our sovereign debt regime, I think in order to have a less predictable hierarchical structure of the sovereign debt regime, you need procedures that randomize the likelihood that for some the law will be made more elastic, while for others it will be fully enforced. I think what sort of reinforces the hierarchical structure in finance so much, both in domestic systems and in global systems right now, is that it's become a completely predictable system. And this is why it can be gamed, and this is why we have fundamental moral hazard problems here. But I think a shift would really require that everybody has access to similar procedures to try to deflect the cost of dealing with future uncertainty. Final comment, I haven't said a word at all about the problem of credible commitments. I think in the Euro debate in particular, but in sovereign debt debates more general, also in credit contracting in domestic settings, the assumption is usually that the major problem of default is cheating or fraud or strategic default by the debtor. And in fact, what many empirical studies suggest, certainly in consumer lending and many other contexts, is that uncertainty is at least as important as strategic default. In consumer lending, divorce, disease, or death, the 3 Ds, are the most important causes for why people cannot pay their loans. I think we've seen in the global financial crisis that an important reason for default by sovereign debtors is fundamental uncertainty. They could not have anticipated the global financial crisis. Their hands, of course, were bound by open capital flow agreements pushed by the IMF and other organizations that left them exposed to financial capital inflows, and they had to deal then with that. And in the aftermath of the financial crisis, also in part because the countries at the core did precisely that. The countries at the core bailed out their financial sectors in order to stabilize their financial system. And after they had done this, the next countries had to do the same, otherwise they would have signaled to the markets that they're really on the periphery. So you push them essentially to overextend their fiscal resources to stabilize the financial system. But then sort of in the second round of the game, we can really see whether the core perceives certain countries as being closer to it than on the periphery, and that is then exposed by how we deal with them, who gets a bailout and who does not get a bailout. I have one chart, but I didn't send it in before, but you might have seen this yourself, but just to re-emphasize the point, Why is Cyprus on the periphery and Greece on the periphery and Spain is closer to the core, as I suggested earlier? Well, this depends on the degree of exposure of German and French and English banks to these countries. So in the early days of the debt crisis, German and French banks were still very much exposed to Greek, which was why Greek just couldn't be allowed to go under. It would have caused too much harm to the core. But 2 years later, after some time was gained and the countries and the banks from these countries had sort of reduced the exposure, you saw the Grexit discussion in the fall of 2012, where it became at least again an option. And for Cyprus, clearly, most of the European banks are not sufficiently exposed to render this a substantial risk, even if Cyprus were now exiting the euro. So again, sort of the bottom line of what I'm trying to say here is when we look at changes in contracting or even statutory regime, an important question I think that we should ask is, how does it affect or reinforce or change the underlying hierarchical structure of financial systems, which I would submit is inherent to financial systems to some extent, but with regards to the question of how elastic will be the commitments in the times of crisis, I think that's a point of entry where we could actually make a difference and don't expose those in the periphery to the full force of the law while bailing out the center. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions, so the floor is open. Devesh?
So just one question to Katharina is, what fundamental change do you think has there been in sovereign debt contracts, not just the structure of the contract, but the manner of enforcement between the Latin American debt crisis and the European crisis?
I don't think there has been a fundamental change, really, in the contracting sense. I mean, we have introduced CACs in some of the emerging market debt, but I think Mitos and Anna's work suggests that they didn't really make much of a change, right? I think a real important change has happened within the Eurozone, because the introduction of the euro suggests that actually the risk or sort of the cost of uncertainty were equally distributed throughout the system, that you could actually borrow at the same price throughout the Eurozone, both the sovereigns and the private borrowers, and the ECB has reinforced this by discounting the different loans at the very same rate. And I think the crisis has exposed the fact that this is actually not true, because ultimately the risk associated with debt depends on whether there's somebody who is the ultimate backstop of a system and who that is, and who actually will be backstopped and who will not be backstopped, right? So I think we've seen that game in Latin America, right? And I think the game that the Eurozone has played with Greece is exactly the game that has been played with Latin America in the 1980s. Buy enough time so that the major banks can pull out, and then you can push the country on the periphery and fully enforce the remaining contracts, right? So I don't think there has been really a fundamental shift, and that's part of the problem. The shock, I think, for the Eurozone was sort of the full revelation how hierarchically structured the Eurozone in fact is, where it had been pretended for a while that it was flat.
Did either of you want to weigh in on that?
Well, it depends on which Latin American crisis you mean, right? So if you're talking about between the 80s and 2010, there's been a pretty big doctrinal shift and a shift in market structure, so that enforcement is somewhat easier, although it's still not easy. And then you have a lot of actors that are willing to enforce, and then you also have accounting and regulatory changes that make it somewhat more likely, right? The other market shift you see is the globalization of domestic debt, and also so emerging markets, Mexico went from having 80% of its debt being foreign debt, pretty inflexible, to having 80% of its debt being domestic debt, right? On the other hand, you see the reverse in Europe, where this was seen as a risk-free asset, and therefore nobody paid attention to the contracts, and all of a sudden it becomes sort of hyper information and contract sensitive. So there are a lot of arguably fundamental changes in parts of the market that have nothing to do with what is being marketed as the deliberate innovation, at least on the legal front, right? And I think part of what we kind of have to think about is how those two parallel sets of changes relate to one another. So how is, how is structural change related to what is marketed as, legal reform?
Yeah, maybe a short point. Don't know whether that makes any sense, but I think in all these questions, and in particular in what you've discussed, it would be very, very important also to consider monetary issues, because I think they closely relate to that issue. Let me give just one example. I think I completely agree with this, or I find it absolutely convincing, this center-periphery dichotomy, and I think the simple answer why we still don't have a default, an open default in Greece, even though the major banks have pulled out, not the Cypriotic banks, but the Western European banks, is monetary regulation, is target 2. Because there's this bomb lurking in the background of which amounts to several billions. And I think also in the developmental context, sovereign debt is intrinsically, and the way we deal with sovereign debt crisis is intrinsically related with monetary aspects. For example, like pegging might to some extent immunize, or it provides favorable investment conditions for a country. It might immunize it against other developed countries taking action against it too early, but then at a certain point, of course, it is a huge risk. So it's basically kind of the Eurozone crisis in a different context, which we experience there.
Can I just say a word about this? I think this is really an important comment, because the Euro crisis is sometimes depicted as being unique, and I think it simply exposes the kind of hierarchical structure that we have in global financial markets in general, right? The point is that in global financial markets, we have typically externalized the cost of uncertainty and other risks to the countries that we're borrowing. Domestically, we have to internalize it. Now, within the Eurozone, we're right in between, right? We would love to externalize it, we can't because it's the common currency that might blow up and have contagion effects that we can't anticipate, which is why we don't do this, but neither do we really want to internalize it, which would be the mutualization.
A brief comment from Philip.
Yeah, just a question. I have to admit that I'm very ignorant about this whole field, but it strikes me as very convincing, this differentiation between the core and the periphery. And that's actually something you learn about the law in any context, basically. The law treats the mighty different than the non-mighty, perhaps. Now, my question is there any way to formalize this? I mean, would there be any, would you say there is a way to sort of legalize the distinction, or to proceduralize the way to deal with this kind of difference? Or is it just something that we have to accept and just wait what happens and see what the mighty do and let the others do?
Well, to some extent, I think it's pretty much inherent in the system, but the way I'm thinking about this right now is to say we have to randomize the propensity of dealing with uncertainty or bearing the cost of uncertainty throughout the system. And the way I'm doing this basically is to force also the lenders again to incorporate uncertainty by suggesting something like what I call uncertainty outs. So all financial contracts, sovereign debt contracts, and other contracts should be just subject to an implied uncertainty out, which means that if the borrower finds him or herself at the end of the rope because of conditions that they had not been able to foresee ex ante, they should have access to a procedure where the contract will be adapted. Very similar to the German clausula rebus ex tantibus. So that's where it comes from. For those of you who are not familiar with it, but I think it's really nice to use a German doctrine in the Euro debate to suggest how this could be done, which is a principle that was invoked in the context of the hyperinflation following World War I, where first the courts in the typical German manner would say, pacta sunt servanda, you have to enforce all contracts as written, and whether the real value of the Reichsmark has declined doesn't really matter, we just enforce the contracts. And then all of a sudden shifted after the courts experienced an endogenous legal boom. All creditors were running faster and faster to the courts. And they used a general principle in contract law, which says all contracts are governed by the principle of good faith, to read into these contracts the principle that if fundamental conditions have changed, then either party can request the courts to adapt their contracts. So this kind of exposed contract adaptation through courts is, we don't have procedures for that at the global level, et cetera, is too complicated, but I think we have to think about mechanisms to do just that. Because if there is fundamental uncertainty, everybody can face it, and there's no reason to expose only some within the system to dealing with the cost of uncertainty. So we need procedures that give others access to that, and by randomizing it, I think we can undermine we can flatten the system a little bit. Now, I think it's completely logical for a system in a severe financial crisis to say we need to save the core, right? So that you will never get off the table. Clearly, they will try to protect them first. But if you create these uncertainty outs, my hope would be that at earlier stages in the crisis, we send strong signals that there are uncertainties in the system that different players have to respond to, and you don't do this only when you are with the back against the wall, where the only option you have is bailout.
Any other questions? Let me just let Anna and then Matthias wrap up. If there are any closing thoughts, sorry, I'm a contracts professor, and so this proposal is troubling to me. And also I have the question of whether you would allow a country that wants to reduce its cost of borrowing to opt out of this implied term, which I take it you would not. Got it. Anna.
So this is the regulatory perspective, which is that I don't think you could do it without really rethinking what the financial sector looks like, because government debt is the base asset in the financial system, and we already have a formalized distinction between core and periphery. Core is that which is considered risk-free for purposes of regulating financial institutions. Core is that which is money on the asset side of the world, the global financial system, right? And the disruption comes when all of a sudden that which you thought was money turns out to be subprime debt. And so I think that whatever whatever your view is on creating the flexibility, I think that's why Katharina, so I'm going to do the reverse plug, which is that you can't rethink sovereign debt without rethinking the broader financial system.
Okay, thank you very much to our panelists, and I think we'll take a break now till 4:30. Thanks.